They stood in that bank lobby, and my own son leaned toward me, close enough that the loan officer could hear every word, and said, "You're not a father anymore. You're a liability." The fluorescent lights kept humming. Nobody moved. The security guard by the door kept scrolling his phone, oblivious, the only sound in the room besides that hum. My daughter-in-law didn't look away from her nails. I stood there holding a printed statement with my name on a loan I had never signed, and I understood, in that single frozen second, that my own family had started talking about me the way you talk about a broken appliance. You're deciding whether to repair or replace. Is any of this even real? I remember thinking. Did my son actually just say that to my face? In public, like I wasn't standing 3 feet away, was the woman across the desk really telling me I owed $340,000 I never borrowed? And who, exactly, had been signing my name for the last 11 months while I sat in my kitchen eating dinner alone, congratulating myself on how quiet and simple my life had become? My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 63 years old. For 33 years, I carried a badge for the United States Postal Inspection Service, which most people don't even know is a real law enforcement agency until they need one. I chased mail fraud rings across 4 states. I put away men who stole identities out of mailboxes for a living, men who could turn a single intercepted bank statement into a forged mortgage inside of a week. I know exactly how patient a good thief has to be. I know exactly how long they're willing to wait before they make their first move. I did not know, sitting in that lobby with my son's contempt still hanging in the recycled air, that the patient thief I'd spent a career hunting had been living under my own roof, wearing my grandson's face at Thanksgiving. The loan officer, a young woman named Priya Anand, who could not have been more than 28, slid the paperwork toward me with visible discomfort. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "this loan was originated 11 months ago, auto financing $68,000 for a vehicle, and a secondary personal line of credit that's since ballooned with 2 other lenders. All 3 list you as primary borrower. All 3 carry your social security number, your date of birth, and what looks like your signature." I looked at that signature. 33 years of examining forged documents does something to your eyes. You stop seeing letters and start seeing pressure points, the places where a hand hesitates, the places where a real signature never hesitates at all. This one hesitated at the K. My K never hesitates. My K comes down hard and fast, the way I learned to write it from my father, who learned it from his. "Derek," I said, "my son." He had his jaw set, his phone already in his hand, already halfway to composing whatever version of this story he planned to tell his wife on the drive home. He didn't even look up. "Dad," he said, "we can talk about this later. Not here." "I want to talk about it here," I said. "It's probably a clerical error," he said. "The bank system flags things wrong all the time. I told you your memory hasn't been what it used to be. This is exactly why we should get your accounts consolidated, so I can manage." I hadn't asked him to manage anything. I hadn't forgotten anything. But I let him finish the sentence, because 33 years in federal law enforcement teaches you one lesson above every other. Never interrupt a man who's still talking. Let him build the whole house. You can always burn it down later, once you've counted every room. His wife, Vanessa, still hadn't looked up from her phone. That was the detail that stayed with me on the drive home, more than the number on the page, more than my son's voice calling me a liability, like I was a leaking roof. It was that Vanessa didn't even flinch. A woman finding out her father-in-law has $340,000 in fraudulent debt attached to his name should, at minimum, raise her eyes. She didn't. She'd already known. I understood that before I understood almost anything else that afternoon. I need to take you back 3 months before that lobby, because none of it started there. It started on a Tuesday in March, the kind of gray Pennsylvania afternoon that makes the whole town of Millbrook look like it's been left out in the rain too long. I was 60 pounds lighter than the man who used to chase forgers through Cincinnati parking garages, but I still walked out to my mailbox every morning at exactly 9:15, because that had been Eleanor's ritual for 38 years of our marriage. And after she died, I kept it going, because stopping felt like one more thing she'd lose. Eleanor and I had no orchard, no forest, no acreage worth millions. We had a modest colonial on Birch Hollow Road, a workshop in the garage where I restored antique mailboxes and postal scales as a hobby that made my son roll his eyes every time he visited, and a marriage that ran on small, deliberate kindnesses. She used to leave notes in the mailbox for me to find alongside the bills, funny little observations about the neighbors, a joke, a reminder that she loved me. She'd been gone 14 months. I still checked the box every morning at 9:15, and every morning since her funeral, I stood there for one extra second before I opened it, bracing myself for the emptiness the way you brace for cold water. That Tuesday, the emptiness came with a letter instead. Cream envelope. Embossed logo, a regional credit union I'd never done business with. Inside, a welcome packet for a new personal line of credit, $40,000, congratulating me on my approval. I hadn't applied for anything. I want to be honest about what I felt reading that letter, because the honest version isn't flattering. I felt afraid before I felt angry. Not for my money. Eleanor and I had lived carefully. We had enough. The house was paid off. My pension was solid. I felt afraid because for one long, ugly second, standing at my own mailbox in my own driveway, I wondered if Derek had been right at Christmas when he'd made that comment about me repeating myself, about me leaving the stove on once, about how maybe it was time to think about help around the house. I wondered if I'd actually applied for this credit line myself and simply forgotten. 63 isn't old, but I'd watched my own father lose pieces of himself at 70. And for one cold second in my driveway, I let that fear own me completely. Then I looked at the signature on the acknowledgement form again, and the fear turned into something colder and more useful. 33 years of pattern recognition doesn't switch off because your wife died and your son thinks you need managing. That K hesitated. Mine never does. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make myself sound like I knew immediately, like some kind of prophet standing at his mailbox reading the future. I didn't. What I had was a suspicion sharp enough to keep, and a lifetime of training that told me the worst thing you can do with a suspicion is act on it before you understand its shape. So I did what I'd done for 3 decades before I ever had a badge to make it official. I wrote it down. I bought a plain black composition notebook that same afternoon at the pharmacy on Route 9, the kind with the marbled cover, the kind that doesn't look like evidence, and I started keeping records the way I used to keep them on cases that mattered. Date, time, what was said, who said it. I dated the first entry March 4th and wrote a single line. Credit union letter, 40,000. Signature wrong. K doesn't hesitate. It would have been easy to call Derek that same night and ask him directly. God knows I wanted to. But 20 years chasing men who lied for a living had taught me something about confrontation. The moment you show a guilty person that you're suspicious, they stop making mistakes, they get careful, they clean up. And a man who's already careful enough to forge a signature that's almost perfect wasn't going to hand me a confession over the phone because his father sounded hurt. I called the credit union instead, gave them my real information, and asked, politely, professionally, the way I'd once questioned hundreds of frightened bank employees who thought they were in trouble, when really they were the last honest people in the room. I asked who had opened the account and what documentation they'd used. A junior compliance officer, sympathetic and slightly panicked once she understood what I was implying, told me the application had come through an online portal, verified with my social security number, my date of birth, a scanned copy of my driver's license, and what their system flagged as a biometric matched signature scanned copy of my license. I hadn't lost my wallet. I hadn't had my license out of my possession in longer than I could remember, which meant somebody had photographed it, at some point, somewhere close enough to me that I hadn't noticed. I didn't know it yet, but that single detail, a photograph of a license I never reported missing, was the first thread of a much longer rope, and at the other end of that rope was a man named Roy Fenn, whom I had never met, who ran something called Fenn Premier Credit Solutions out of a strip mall office 40 minutes from my house, and who had built an entire second career convincing desperate people that stealing from the elderly wasn't really stealing if you called it restructuring. I closed the notebook that night and sat in my kitchen a long time, the overhead light buzzing the way the bank lobby lights would buzz 3 months later, and I thought about Eleanor. About the promise I'd made her in the hospital, 6 weeks before she died, when she was lucid enough to worry about things that hadn't happened yet. She'd held my hand with a grip that had almost no strength left in it, and said, "Walter, don't let this family fall apart chasing money. Whatever happens after I'm gone. Promise me you'll protect the people, not the property." I promised her. I meant it. I still mean it now, even after everything. But I want to say plainly, because it matters to how this story ends. Protecting people sometimes means refusing to protect them from consequences, and I didn't understand that difference yet. Not fully, not on a gray Tuesday in March, with a fraudulent credit letter shaking slightly in my hand. I need to admit something else here, something I didn't write in the notebook because it embarrassed me too much to make official. Since Eleanor died, I'd developed a small, stupid habit. Some mornings, when the mailbox door creaked open and I saw the shape of an envelope that reminded me of her handwriting, and after 14 months, plenty of envelopes still did, for no reason at all, my hands would go still for a second before I could make myself reach in. A grown man, a federal law enforcement veteran who'd once talked a man down from a loaded gun in a Toledo post office, standing frozen at his own mailbox because grief doesn't care what you used to be good at. My neighbor, an older widow named Carol Ashby, who walked her dog past my house every morning, had started quietly grabbing my mail and setting it on my porch step some days, without ever mentioning why, without ever making me explain the hesitation she must have noticed. I let her. That's the kind of small mercy you accept when you're not ready to examine why you need it. I bring this up not because it changes anything about what Derek and Vanessa did, but because it's true, and because a story where the wronged man is simply strong the entire time isn't an honest story. I was strong about some things that spring. I was not strong about all of them. 2 weeks after the credit union letter, a second one arrived. Different lender, different amount, same pattern, a personal loan I hadn't requested, $62,000 this time, disbursed already to an account I didn't recognize. I photographed both letters on my phone before I did anything else, a habit so old, it was closer to instinct than decision. Then I drove to the county clerk's office and pulled every document search I could legally access under my own name. What I found made the notebook fill up fast. 4 separate credit inquiries in 5 months, 2 loans already disbursed, 1 vehicle financing application, still pending, for a black Range Rover that I would later learn was already parked in my son's driveway, registered under a temporary tag. I sat in my truck in the clerk's office parking lot with that information glowing on my phone screen, and I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in 14 months. Not since the last time I'd stood over Eleanor's hospital bed and known with absolute certainty that the next thing I did mattered more than almost anything I'd done before it. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere across town, in an office above a nail salon, Roy Fenn was telling my son that the next withdrawal needed to happen faster, because the syndicate backing his own operation didn't extend patient timelines to people who were behind on interest. I didn't know yet that my son wasn't the architect of any of this. I didn't know that the woman who hadn't looked up from her phone in that bank lobby had been the one drawing the blueprints for over a year, ever since an online trading account she'd hidden from Derek collapsed and took $200,000 of borrowed money down with it. I only knew what the paper trail told me, and paper trails, I'd learned across 3 decades, always tell the truth, eventually. People lie. Documents, given enough time and enough scrutiny, do not. That night I called an old friend. Not a lawyer yet. That would come later. And it would matter enormously when it did, but a man named Marcus Delane, who I'd trained straight out of the academy in 1994, and who now ran the fraud task force out of the Regional Postal Inspection Field Office 2 counties over. We'd stayed close the way men do after they've stood in a doorway together, while somebody pointed a gun at both of them. Marcus had spoken at Eleanor's funeral. He still called me on her birthday, every year, just to say her name out loud to somebody who remembered her. "Marcus," I said, when he picked up, "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to tell me honestly whether I'm imagining this because I'm lonely and old, or whether I'm seeing something real. Walter, he said, you've never imagined a fraud pattern in your life. What have you got? I told him everything. The letters, the signature that hesitated at the wrong letter, the scanned license nobody had reported stolen, the vehicle in my son's driveway with a temporary tag. Marcus went quiet in that particular way he used to go quiet during briefings. The silence of a man building a case file in real time behind his eyes. If this is what it sounds like, he said finally, this isn't a family misunderstanding, Walter. This is identity theft, and if there's a pattern of multiple lenders, there's a real chance whoever's running it isn't running it just on you. People who build machines like this rarely stop at one victim. You understand what I'm telling you to do, right? Document everything. Don't confront anyone yet. Let me see what I can pull through legitimate channels. Nothing that touches evidence rules. Nothing that gets thrown out later because somebody got impatient. If your son's name comes up connected to a lender complaint already on file somewhere, that changes what I can request. It did come up. 3 weeks later, Marcus called me back with something that made the back of my neck go cold in a way no amount of March wind ever had. A separate, unrelated complaint had been filed 8 months earlier by an 81-year-old widow in the next county over, alleging unauthorized loans opened in her name by a credit repair consultant who'd befriended her at her church. The consultant's business card, attached to the complaint file, read Fen Premier Credit Solutions. I didn't know yet what that name would come to mean. I didn't know it yet, but the machine that had opened fraudulent loans under my name had already destroyed at least one other family before it ever touched mine, and the man running it had a name, an office, and, I would eventually discover, a very specific, very human weakness of his own that would become the last domino in this entire collapse. What I knew that night, sitting at my kitchen table with the composition notebook open in front of me, and Eleanor's photograph watching from the mantel the way it had watched every important decision I'd made since she died, was simple. My son had either done something unforgivable, or he was caught inside something bigger than himself, and too frightened or too proud to say so. Either way, I was not going to find the truth by asking him nicely at a family dinner. I was going to find it the way I'd found every hard truth in 33 years of federal service, patiently, on paper, one intercepted piece of evidence at a time, until the people who'd underestimated a grieving old man standing at his mailbox understood exactly what they'd been standing next to the whole time. I closed the notebook. Outside, the porch light Carol Ashby always left on for her evening dog walk clicked to life across the street, small and steady against the dark. I thought about Eleanor's promise again, protect the people, not the property, and I told myself, honestly believing it at the time, that this was exactly what I intended to do. I had no idea yet how many people that promise would eventually require me to protect, or how many of them would turn out to be closer to the center of my own family than I could have imagined sitting there that night. 33 years of instinct telling me the shape of a lie, long before I understood its full size. Marcus called back 4 days later with something I hadn't expected, and it changed the entire shape of what I thought I was investigating. The widow in the neighboring county, her name was Doris Feldkamp, 79, not 81 as the initial file had said, hadn't just been approached by a credit repair consultant. She'd been approached twice. Once by Roy Fenn himself, smooth and reassuring in a cheap blazer, promising to help her consolidate the medical debt her late husband left behind. And once, months later, by a young woman who never gave her real name, who'd sat with Doris at her kitchen table for 2 hours, gained her trust, and walked away with photographs of her Medicare card, her driver's license, and a canceled check bearing her signature. Doris couldn't identify the young woman in a photo lineup. But she remembered one detail clearly enough to put in her sworn statement. The woman had a small tattoo of a compass, rose on the inside of her left wrist, visible when she reached across the table to pour the coffee she'd brought as a gift. Vanessa had a compass rose tattoo on her left wrist. I'd noticed it at Thanksgiving, 3 years ago, when she'd rolled up her sleeve to help Eleanor with the dishes, and Eleanor had asked her, delighted, what it meant. Vanessa had said something about always finding her way home. Eleanor had loved that answer. Eleanor had died believing it. I sat with that piece of information for 2 full days before I wrote it in the notebook, because writing it made it real in a way that simply knowing it hadn't. Under the entry I finally made, March 29th, Doris Feldkamp, compass tattoo, left wrist matches V. I wrote one more line, smaller, in handwriting I barely recognized as my own. I don't know yet if Derek knows. That question sat at the center of everything for the next 6 weeks. Not whether fraud had happened, that was no longer in doubt. The question that kept me awake was whether my son was the architect of it, or its first victim, dressed up to look like a partner, because it was easier for everyone involved, including himself, if he told himself the lie loudly enough. I didn't know it yet, but I would eventually learn the truth was both, in a way that made it harder to hate him, not easier. I started watching my son the way I used to watch Suspects, which is a different kind of watching than the way a father watches a son. I noticed things I'd been too grief-numb to notice before. He'd lost weight. He flinched when his phone buzzed, every single time. A full-body flinch before he even looked at the screen. He'd started parking 2 streets over from his own house some evenings, according to Carol Ashby, who mentioned it to me over the fence one Saturday with the particular delicacy of a woman who suspects something is wrong in a family and doesn't want to be the one to say it first. "I don't miss much anymore, Walter," she told me, "but I don't like the way that boy looks lately, like he's waiting for a door to open that he's afraid of." I invited him to the house that Sunday, alone, no Vanessa. Using the excuse that I wanted his opinion on a mailbox I was restoring for a museum donation, a lie so small and so tied to my old life that it worked exactly the way I hoped it would, easing him through the door without suspicion. He sat in my workshop for 20 minutes before he said anything real. I let him. I'd learned that lesson decades ago, interviewing frightened people in rooms far less comfortable than my own garage. Silence does more work than questions. If you're willing to let it sit long enough to become unbearable for the other person instead of you. "Dad," he said finally, staring at the postal scale I was cleaning instead of at me, "do you ever feel like you made one decision? Just one? A long time ago, and you've spent every day since then paying for it in ways you didn't understand were coming." "I set the scale down every day of my career," I said. "That's most of what fraud investigation is, son. Watching people pay slowly for one decision they made when they were desperate and thought no one would ever check." He flinched at the word desperate the way I'd watched him flinch at his phone. "I want to be honest," I said, "because I need you to hear this from me before you hear it from a stranger with a badge. I know about the loans. I know they're under my name. I know I never signed for them." He didn't deny it. That was the moment I understood how deep it went. Not the confession he gave me, which came slowly, in pieces, over the next hour, but the fact that he didn't even try to lie first. A guilty man with nothing left to protect doesn't bother lying to his father in an empty garage on a Sunday afternoon. "It started with one loan," he said, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12 years old and had wrecked my truck trying to impress a girl from school. "Vanessa's trading account. She never told me how bad it got. 200,000, Dad. Gone in 11 days, some crypto collapse she didn't understand until it was already over. We were going to lose the house. She found this man, Fenn. He said he could get us short-term relief if we use someone with clean credit and a spotless history as a cosigner, just for one loan, just to cover the gap until her severance came through from the job she'd actually already lost 2 months before she told me. You used my identity," I said. "Not asking, confirming. I told myself it was borrowing," he said. "I told myself I'd pay every dollar back before you ever noticed, and you'd never even have to know it happened. And then it wasn't one loan anymore, and I didn't understand how that happened. And every time I tried to stop it, Fenn would remind me what he already had on record with my name attached to it. And Vanessa would say we were so close to fixing it. Just one more. Just one more." He put his face in his hands. I stood there in my own garage, holding a 90-year-old postal scale, watching my son fall apart in a way he hadn't let me see since his mother's funeral, when he'd stood dry-eyed and rigid through the entire service and then broken completely, alone in my car afterward, sobbing so hard I'd had to pull over. I did something then that surprised both of us. I set the scale down on the workbench, and I crossed the garage, and I put my arms around my son the way I hadn't in years, both of us too proud and too quiet to be men who embraced easily. He was shaking. I could feel how thin he'd become, how much weight fear had carried off him in months. I hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. "I'm not going to pretend what you did is small," I said, my voice rough against his shoulder. "It isn't. But I need to know the truth now. All of it. Because I think you're not the only one in that house who's been lying, and I don't think you're the one who built this." He pulled back and looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my son looked like a boy again instead of a man performing competence he didn't feel. "It's bigger than the one loan, isn't it?" he said. "It's bigger than us." I didn't answer him directly, because I still wasn't certain how much I could safely say, even to my own son, about an active federal inquiry. What I told him instead was this: "Whatever happens next, Derek, you have exactly one path back to being a man I can respect again, and it isn't hiding. It's telling the truth to the people whose job it is to sort out how much of this was you, and how much of it was done to you." He didn't answer that day, but he didn't leave angry either, which told me something had shifted, even if I couldn't yet be sure how far. I want to slow down here because the next month was less about drama and more about the kind of grinding, patient work most people never see in these stories, the part where a case actually gets built, one verified document at a time, instead of one dramatic confrontation. Marcus's task force, working from Doris Feldkamp's formal complaint and a second complaint that surfaced from a retired schoolteacher in Lancaster County. Once word quietly spread through elder services networks that someone was finally looking at Fen Premier Credit Solutions, opened an official inquiry. That mattered enormously, because it meant everything gathered from that point forward could actually be used, cleanly, in a courtroom. Unlike anything I might have dug up myself by doing something rash, like breaking into Fen's office or hacking into Vanessa's accounts, which is exactly the kind of shortcut that gets an entire case thrown out before it starts. What I could legally do, and did, was cooperate as a victim witness, hand over every document I'd received, authorize the credit bureaus and lenders to share their fraud files with investigators, and use my own decades of pattern recognition training to help Marcus's analysts see connections faster than they might have on their own. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I never once accessed anyone's private accounts, never intercepted a message that wasn't legally obtained through a warrant Marcus's office secured once probable cause existed. Everything that eventually broke this case open came from documents that were either mine to begin with, voluntarily surrendered by cooperating parties, or lawfully compelled once a judge signed off on it. 33 years taught me that evidence gathered the wrong way, however satisfying it feels in the moment, becomes a weapon that guilty use against you in court. I wasn't going to hand Roy Fenn or Vanessa a technicality after everything Doris Feldkamp had already lost. The financial architecture of what Fenn had built, once investigators laid it out for me, was uglier and more organized than I'd expected, though I'll spare you most of the mechanics. Because mechanics were never the part of this that mattered. What mattered was this: Fenn ran what looked, on paper, like a legitimate credit counseling business and used it to identify financially desperate people, some of them fraud victims themselves, like Vanessa, who could be pressured into recruiting elderly relatives or acquaintances as unwitting collateral. He took a cut of every fraudulent loan. He held enough documented evidence of each recruiter's participation to making walking away feel impossible. It was a machine built entirely on leverage, on fear, on the particular kind of desperation that convinces a person the shortcut in front of them is the only door left. 11 victims investigators eventually confirmed across 3 counties over 4 years. I was the 12th, and though none of us knew it yet, very nearly the one who brought the whole structure down. The piece that finally cracked it open wasn't a spreadsheet or a wire transfer record. It was small, physical, and it sat for weeks in a shoebox at the back of Derek and Vanessa's closet before I ever laid eyes on it. It happened almost by accident. Derek, 3 weeks into what had become a quiet, Careful reconciliation between us. Sunday dinners again, slower conversations. Him showing up without Vanessa more often than either of us said out loud, asked if I'd come help him move some old boxes out of the garage, while Vanessa was at what she called a client meeting, the kind of vague phrase I'd learned, by then, to hear as a small alarm bell. In one of the boxes, mixed in with tax documents and old wedding photos, was a padded mailer, unlabeled, the kind of thing you wouldn't look at twice unless you'd spent 3 decades learning exactly what kind of shipping materials a forger uses when they don't want a return address traced. Darek didn't know what it was. I did, almost the second I lifted it and felt the particular weight and shape inside. I asked if I could open it. He said yes, his face already going pale, some instinct in him recognizing that whatever it wasn't good. Inside was a rubber stamp, custom made, the kind you order from a novelty engraving shop that doesn't ask many questions about why a customer wants an exact replica of someone else's signature. My signature. Not close. Exact. Down to the hard, fast stroke on the K that never hesitates. The one detail no forger working from a photograph had managed to reproduce by hand in any of the 4 fraudulent loan applications. Somebody had gotten hold of an actual, original document with my real signature on it, a document precise enough to engrave from, and I understood, holding that stamp in my workshop with my son, standing frozen beside me, exactly which document that had been. Eleanor's funeral guest book. I'd signed it, of course, my own wife's funeral, my hand shaking so badly that day that the signature had come out unusually large, unusually clear, spread across an entire line by itself. Vanessa had been the one who offered gently, tearfully, to have the guest book professionally preserved and copied for the family archive. I remembered thanking her for the thoughtfulness. I remembered thinking at the time, what a kind thing that was to do for a grieving old man. I stood in my garage, holding the instrument that had stolen my identity, made from a page memorializing my wife's death, and something in me went very quiet and very still, the particular stillness I used to feel in the moment right before an arrest, when all the noise of a long investigation finally resolves into one clean, cold certainty. I didn't know it yet. But that stamp, small enough to close a fist around, ordinary enough to mail in a padded envelope, would end up sitting on an evidence table in a federal courtroom 11 weeks later, entered as Exhibit 4, the single piece of physical proof that turned a tangle of loan documents and testimony into an airtight case. Durek looked like he might be sick. She told me she was preserving Mom's book for us, he said. I helped her pack it up to send to the printer. I carried it to the mailbox myself, Dad. I carried the thing she used to do this to you. I didn't say anything cruel to him in that moment, though I could have. I thought instead about something Eleanor used to say, one of those small, worn phrases that sound like nothing until you need them years later. The mail always finds its address eventually, even when it takes the long way. She used to say it about letters that got lost and turned up months later, forwarded 3 times, battered, at the edges but still legible. I'd never thought of it as anything but a sweet, small saying until I stood in that garage and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that everything Vanessa had built out of my grief was finally, inevitably, finding its way back to the one place she'd never expected it to travel. Straight into evidence, straight into daylight, straight into a courtroom, where a jury would eventually hear every word of it read aloud. There was one more piece that shifted things before I called Marcus with what we'd found, and it came from somewhere I hadn't expected. From my grandson, Miles, 7 years old, Derek and Vanessa's son, who I'd been spending more time with over those weeks, as the tension in his parents' house grew thick enough that Derek started dropping him at my place 2 afternoons a week, just to give the boy somewhere calmer to be. We were in the workshop, Miles sorting old stamps into a shoebox lid while I worked, when he asked me, out of nothing, the kind of question children ask that adults spend years learning to avoid. "Grandpa," he said, "if Mommy did something bad because she was scared, is it still bad?" I set down my tools. I asked him what he meant. "I heard her crying on the phone," he said. "She said she didn't mean for it to get this big." "Is it still bad if you didn't mean for it to get big?" I thought about Eleanor's promise for a long time before I answered him. Protect the people, not the property. And I understood, sitting across from a 7-year-old with a shoebox lid full of 40-year-old stamps in his lap, that the promise had never been about protecting people from consequences. It had been about protecting people from becoming only the worst thing they'd ever done. I told him the truth, as much of it as a 7-year-old could carry. Yes, I said, it can still be wrong, even if you didn't mean for it to get so big. But being scared doesn't make someone all bad either, Miles. Most people who do wrong things are scared people first. That doesn't erase what they did. It just means there's usually more than one true thing about a person at the same time. He nodded slowly, the way children do when they've received an answer bigger than the question they asked, and went back to sorting stamps. And I sat there in the quiet of my workshop with my chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with fraud or evidence or the shoebox in my closet, and everything to do with the fact that somewhere in that house, my grandson had already learned to listen through walls for the sound of his mother's fear. I called Marcus that night. I told him about the stamp, about the funeral guest book, about Vanessa's role finally coming into focus with a clarity none of us had had before. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Walter," he said finally, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit down for it if you're not already sitting." I told him. I was sitting. Fenn's operation isn't just running scared people like your daughter-in-law anymore, he said. We've been watching his communications under a warrant for the last 9 days, since Doris Feldkamp's case gave us enough for a judge to sign off. He's escalating. He thinks Vanessa's getting cold feet, thinks she might talk. There's a family event coming up, isn't there? Some kind of anniversary? Their 10-year vow renewal, I said. Next month. Derek mentioned it before all this. Vanessa insisted on it. Wanted something to celebrate while everything else was falling apart, he said. Marcus exhaled slowly. We think Fenn's planning to use that event as a deadline, he said. One more loan, timed around it, to cover what Vanessa already owes him personally, not the syndicate, him directly. If it goes through, it triggers financing large enough that we lose the ability to intervene quietly. Walter, I think that's when this ends. One way or another. The question is whether it ends on our terms, with everyone in that family still standing afterward, or whether it ends the way Fenn wants it to end, which is with your daughter-in-law so deep in his debt she does whatever he says for the rest of her life, and your son right there beside her. I looked across my workshop at the shoebox holding the rubber stamp, at Miles's abandoned pile of old stamps still sitting where he'd left them, at the small, ordinary tools of a life I'd spent 33 years using to catch people exactly like Roy Fenn. Then tell me what you need from me, I said. And let's make sure it ends on our terms. Marcus didn't waste time. Within 72 hours, the Joint Task Force, postal inspection alongside 2 FBI agents out of the Philadelphia field office, who'd been quietly building a wire fraud case against Fenn's syndicate for months before Doris Feldkamp's complaint ever crossed my desk, had a federal magistrate sign off on expanded surveillance. Legal, warranted, narrow in scope. Fenn's business communications, his known devices, the accounts tied directly to Fenn Premier Credit Solutions. Nothing touching Vanessa's personal phone, nothing touching Derek, nothing that would come back later to poison the case with an illegal search. I want to be plain about that because it mattered more to me than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. I'd spent a career watching good cases collapse because someone got impatient and cut a corner. I wasn't going to let grief or anger make me the reason Doris Feldkamp never saw justice. I didn't know it yet. But somewhere in that surveillance, agents would have the single message that finally explained why Roy Fenn never worried about anyone stopping him. A message revealing that his silent partner, the man actually financing the syndicate's larger loans, was a disbarred former attorney named Curtis Whitlock who'd once, 20 years earlier, been investigated by my own division and walked free on a technicality I hadn't been senior enough to prevent. Some debts, it turns out, take decades to come due. I'll come back to that. For 2.5 weeks, life in Millbrook looked almost ordinary from the outside. I went to my Sunday dinners with Derek. Miles sorted stamps in my workshop and asked me questions about mailboxes that had nothing to do with the fear I now understood was living quietly under his roof. Vanessa, according to Derek, grew tighter and more brittle by the day, snapping at small things, disappearing for hours she wouldn't account for, coming home some nights with her makeup smudged in a way that told a story she never told out loud. I want to say something here that I didn't understand myself until much later, something I only came to appreciate once the whole thing was finished, and I had time to sit with it. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the only person who knows how bad something has already become. I carried that loneliness through those 2.5 weeks the way I'd carried Eleanor's absence at the mailbox every morning, quietly, privately, telling almost no one. Because telling too many people too soon is how careful men lose the advantage they've spent months building. The raid on Fenn's office happened on a Thursday morning in late April, and though I wasn't inside the building when it occurred, Marcus called me 20 minutes afterward, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man and patient case finally pay off in real time. They went in with a search warrant at 9:40, he told me. Fenn had 3 other loan files open on his desk, active ones, other families being run through the exact same machine that ran you. And Walter, Vanessa, was there, in his office, 12 minutes before the warrant hit. I asked him what happened. She was mid-sentence, apparently, pleading with him about something. The agent said it looked like she was trying to walk back a deadline, trying to buy time. And then 6 federal agents came through that door, and one of them set the warrant down flat on Fenn's desk, right in front of both of them, and read him his rights while Vanessa stood there in the middle of the room, with nowhere to go. One of the younger agents told me she didn't even try to run. She just stood very still and watched them cuff him, like she already knew, somewhere underneath the panic, that this had always been where it was going to end. I felt something in my chest ease slightly at that news, and something else tighten. Relief and grief rarely arrive separately in a story like this one. Fenn's arrest meant the machine was breaking. It also meant Vanessa's name was now formally part of a federal investigation file, and whatever came next for her, for my grandson's mother, was no longer a private family matter I could quietly manage from a garage workbench. Durek called me that evening, and for the first time since this whole thing began, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since before Eleanor got sick, something almost like clarity. "She's terrified, Dad," he said. "She thinks it's over for both of us." I told her it doesn't have to be over for me because I told the truth the day you sat me down in the garage. I told her I'm done lying to protect a version of this family that was never actually safe to begin with. "That's the truest thing you've said to me in a year," I told him. There was a long pause. "Then, Dad, there's still the vow renewal, 2 weeks from now. Vanessa wants to go through with it anyway, like nothing's happening. She says if we cancel it, everyone will know something's wrong, and she can't survive people knowing yet. I don't even know if I want to go through with it. I don't know if I know her at all anymore." I thought about that for a long moment, standing in my kitchen with the porch light across the street clicking on the way it did every evening at dusk. Carol Ashby's small, steady signal that the world kept turning even on nights like this one. Go through with it. I told him finally. Marcus's people already suspect Fenn's operation was pressuring her toward one final loan, timed around some kind of family event. If that event is your vow renewal, then it's already going to happen whether you cancel the party or not. Better it happens in a room full of witnesses than in some empty office where nobody's watching. I didn't say the rest of what I was thinking, because I didn't fully understand it myself yet, that some part of me needed to be in that room too, needed to stand in front of the people who'd underestimated me and let them understand, in front of witnesses, exactly what a grieving old man with 33 years of federal training was capable of doing quietly, patiently, while everyone around him assumed he was simply fading. The 2 weeks that followed moved the way the final stretch of a long investigation always moves. Slow in the daylight hours, fast in the moments that mattered. Marcus's task force confirmed what they'd suspected. Fenn, even from a jail cell awaiting arraignment, had communicated through his attorney a final instruction to associates still operating outside his direct control. Close the loan tied to Vanessa's remaining personal debt before the vow renewal, using documentation already prepared, or her cooperation with prosecutors, which Fenn now correctly suspected was coming, would be worth nothing to protect her from what he still had on file connecting her to the earlier thefts, including Doris Feldkamp's case. In other words, even under arrest, even with agents reading every message that moved through his network, Fenn was still trying to force one last theft through before the walls closed in completely. I didn't know it yet, but that final desperate instruction, traced, documented, time-stamped by investigators legally monitoring his associates' communications under the same warrant that had already broken his office wide open, would become the single piece of evidence that proved premeditation extended all the way to the day of the ceremony itself. Every scheme I'd learned across 3 decades leaves a trail, even a dying one, especially a dying one. The morning of the vow renewal, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror longer than I had in years, buttoning a shirt Eleanor had picked out for me at Christmas the year before she died, navy blazer over it, because some habits from 33 years of federal service never fully leave a man. You dress the way you want the room to remember you, whether or not you plan on saying a single word. I drove to the small event hall Derek and Vanessa had rented on the edge of town, the same kind of place that hosts wedding receptions and Rotary Club dinners, string lights already glowing pale gold against a sky that hadn't fully gone dark yet. Miles found me in the parking lot before I'd even reached the door, running at me the way 7-year-olds run, full speed, no hesitation, and threw his arms around my waist. "Grandpa," he said, "are you going to fix it tonight?" "Mommy said something's going to get fixed tonight." I knelt down to his level, the way I used to kneel to talk to frightened witnesses half his age older, back when my knees still let me kneel without complaint. "Something's going to get more honest tonight," I told him. "That's not always the same thing as fixed right away. But it's the only road that leads there eventually." He nodded the serious, careful nod children give adults when they've decided to trust an answer they don't fully understand, and ran off to find his cousins. Inside, the room was exactly what you'd expect. 12 round tables, a small dance floor, Derek and Vanessa's 10-year wedding photo blown up on an easel near the entrance, string lights crisscrossing the ceiling. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in over a year, old friends of Eleanor's, a few former colleagues from my postal service days who Derek had apparently invited out of some sense of family obligation neither of us discussed. Carol Ashby was there too, seated near the back, which surprised me until I remembered that Derek had grown fond of her over the past several weeks, the way people grow fond of anyone who's been quietly kind to someone they love during a hard season. I found a seat near the front, close enough to see everything, far enough to watch without being watched myself. Old habits, the kind that never fully retire. The ceremony portion began at 7. Derek and Vanessa stood at the front of the room, a small arch of flowers behind them, an officiant reading the kind of gentle, generic words officiants read at these events. I watched Vanessa's hands. They were shaking, almost imperceptibly. The same tremor I'd learned to recognize decades ago, in people about to be caught in something they no longer had the strength to keep hiding. It happened during the vow exchange. Of all moments, the one part of the evening designed to be the most private, the most sacred, the least suited for what came next. 2 men in plain suits entered from the side door near the caterer's staging area, moving with the particular unhurried authority I recognized instantly, having worn that same walk myself more times than I could count. Marcus was one of them. I hadn't known he'd be there. I found out later he'd asked the event hall manager for permission an hour earlier quietly, showing credentials, explaining there was an active federal matter that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. The room went still in that particular way. Rooms go still right before something irreversible happens. Not silent, exactly, because somewhere near the back a chair scraped. A child laughed at something unrelated. The string lights kept humming faintly overhead, indifferent to what was about to unfold beneath them. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed the way you breathe when everything is normal. Marcus walked directly to Vanessa, not to Derek, and set a single folded document flat on the small table beside the flower arch. The same gesture, I would think later, that another agent had used on Roy Fenn's desk 3 weeks earlier. This isn't how I wanted to do this, he said quietly. But not so quietly the front tables couldn't hear every word. Vanessa Kessler, I need you to step outside with me. There's a matter connected to an active federal investigation that requires your immediate cooperation. Vanessa didn't move for a long moment. Then she turned, not toward Marcus, but toward me, sitting 3 rows back in my navy blazer with my hands folded in my lap, the way I used to sit in courtrooms, waiting for a verdict I already knew was coming. You did this, she said. Her voice carried across the whole silent room. You couldn't just let an old man's confusion be an old man's confusion. You had to go digging, had to go playing detective again, like you're still somebody important, and now you've ruined this in front of everyone, in front of his son, in front of Eleanor's friends. She stopped herself half a second too late, the way people do when their own fury outruns their judgment. Don't you dare say her name, Derek said. His voice cracked the room open wider than Marcus's document had. He stepped between Vanessa and the flower arch, physically, his whole body turning toward his wife instead of standing beside her, the exact opposite of every instinct that had governed him for the past 11 months. Don't you dare stand at our vow renewal and use my mother's memory to try to make him the villain. He didn't do this to us, Vanessa. You did. I let you. God help me. I let you for a year because I was too scared and too proud to admit what we'd become. But he's the only person in this entire family who spent the last 2 months trying to save what's left of it. The room stayed frozen through all of it, the way rooms freeze in the exact moment they realize a family is unraveling in real time in front of them. No one certain whether looking away or watching is the more respectful thing to do. Marcus stepped forward again, gently but without hesitation. Vanessa, he said, we can do this here, in front of everyone, or we can step outside where it's private. That choice is still yours. But it needs to happen now. She looked at Derek for a long moment, searching his face, I think, for some sign that this was still reversible, that if she found the right words the last 11 months could still be undone. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. Something in her shoulders finally gave way, the posture of a woman who has been holding a structure upright, with nothing but sheer will for so long that when it finally collapses, it collapses all at once. She let Marcus walk her toward the side door. Just before she reached it, she turned back one final time, and for a moment I thought she might apologize, might say something that would let the whole room exhale. He was never even that good a father, she said instead, quiet enough that only the front tables caught it, but loud enough that I did. Eleanor practically raised that boy alone while he was off chasing criminals for 30 years. Don't let him stand there now, like he was ever really present for any of it. The room didn't gasp. Exactly. It did something quieter and worse. It went still in the particular way a room goes still, when it realizes a cruel thing has just been said that also happens to contain a splinter of truth. I sat with that splinter for a long moment before I stood up, my knees protesting the way they always did now, and walked to the front of the room, past Derek, past the flower arch, close enough to the microphone that the officiant, uncertain what else to do, quietly handed it to me. She's not entirely wrong, I said, and I felt the room brace for whatever might come next. I was gone 200 nights a year for most of Derek's childhood, chasing men who thought stealing from strangers was a victimless kind of clever. I told myself it mattered more than being home for dinner. Some weeks I still believe that. Most weeks now, I don't. Eleanor raised our son largely by herself, while I built a career out of protecting people I'd never met, and I didn't understand until she was gone how much that cost both of them. I looked at Derek, whose eyes had gone wet in a way I hadn't seen since his mother's funeral. That's true, and I own it, I said. But it doesn't erase what happened here tonight. And it doesn't undo 11 months of my own son's name and my dead wife's signature, and my own identity being sold off piece by piece to cover someone else's debts. A man can be an imperfect father and still deserve better than that. Both of those things are true at the same time. I've had to learn that the hard way more than once in the last 2 months. I set the microphone down. Nobody clapped because it wasn't that kind of moment. But I noticed, scattered around the room, people I hadn't expected. 3 former Postal Service colleagues who'd driven 2 hours to be there, Carol Ashby near the back, Even Doris Feldkamp, whom Marcus must have invited without telling me, sitting quietly near the exit, having come simply to see, with her own eyes, that the machine that had taken so much from her was finally coming apart. All of them rising, not to applaud, but simply to stand quietly, the way people stand for something they respect too much to interrupt with noise. Miles found me again in that stillness, threading through the tables the way children do when the adults around them have forgotten, briefly, that a child is still watching everything. He took my hand without saying anything at all, and I understood that whatever happened next, the arrests, the paperwork, the long, slow unwinding of a year's worth of fraud into a case file thick enough to bury Roy Fenn and everyone connected to him, the truest justice in that room had already happened. A boy who'd spent months listening through walls for the sound of his mother's fear had just watched, in front of everyone who mattered, his grandfather tell the truth about his own failures, instead of only pointing at someone else's. The next 6 weeks moved with the particular grinding slowness of federal process, the kind no television drama ever bothers to show because it isn't dramatic, only necessary. I'll keep the financial and legal mechanics brief here, the way 33 years of testimony taught me a courtroom actually wants them. Not because they don't matter, but because they were never the heart of what happened to my family. Vanessa cooperated fully once she understood what Fenn's associates had already handed investigators about her own exposure. Her attorney negotiated a plea to reduced federal charges, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, with her cooperation against Fenn, and more significantly against Curtis Whitlock, the disbarred attorney who'd been financing the syndicate's larger loans from behind a wall of shell entities. Marcus's forensic accountant spent 3 weeks untangling. Whitlock, it turned out, had been running versions of this same operation since the very case my division investigated him for 2 decades earlier, simply smarter this time, simply more patient, until a grieving old man at a mailbox in Millbrook proved more patient still. Vanessa's cooperation earned her 18 months, a fraction of what she might have faced otherwise, along with a lifetime restriction from any financial advisory or lending adjacent work. Derek, whose role prosecutors ultimately determined was substantially coerced rather than architected, avoided incarceration entirely, 3 years of probation, mandatory restitution contributions, and a permanent federal fraud flag on his own credit that would follow him for the rest of his working life. A consequence he told me, quietly, he considered fair. Fenn received 11 years. Whitlock, facing the accumulated weight of 2 separate investigations 20 years apart, received 14. Every fraudulent loan under my name was discharged. The credit bureaus corrected within 90 days. Once the federal findings were entered into record, my identity restored to something resembling the clean, quiet life I'd had before a cream-colored envelope arrived at my mailbox on a gray Tuesday in March. I want to be honest that the restoration of numbers on a page felt almost beside the point by the time it finally happened. Money returns. Some things don't. That was the true subplot, and I'll leave it there, because it was never where the real story lived. The real story lived in a small brown cardboard box I found 4 weeks after the vow renewal, going through Eleanor's things in the closet we'd shared for 38 years, things I hadn't been able to face sorting since her funeral. Derek was helping me, that Saturday, the two of us working in a silence that had become comfortable again in a way it hadn't been in over a year, when I found it. A shoebox, unlabeled, tucked behind a stack of old photo albums, filled with letters Eleanor had never sent. She used to do that, I remembered then, in the last months, when the chemo made her too tired most days to do much beyond sit in the recliner by the window. She wrote letters she never mailed, practice runs at things she wanted to say and never found the strength or the right moment to say out loud. One of them was addressed, in her looping, careful hand, to Derek. I didn't open it. I set it in his hands instead, and I watched my son sit down on the edge of his childhood bed, in the room that still had his old baseball trophies on the shelf, because neither of us had ever gotten around to boxing them up, and read his mother's handwriting for the first time in 14 months. I'll share only what he chose to share with me afterward, because some things belong entirely to the person they were written for. She'd written it 8 months before she died, apparently after some small disagreement between Derek and Vanessa that Eleanor had witnessed and worried over more than either of them realized at the time. She hadn't known anything about loans or forged signatures or a man named Roy Fenn. How could she have? What she'd written was simpler than that, and truer for being simple. A mother's plain worry that her son and his wife were letting money and fear crowd out the softer things that actually held a marriage and a family together. Don't let love become something you owe each other instead of something you give each other, she'd written. Your father and I built our whole life on small kindnesses instead of big promises. Promise me you'll try to do the same. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Derek read it twice, and then he cried in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy, and I sat beside him on the bed and let him, because some griefs need witnesses more than they need comfort. I need to say something here that took me weeks after that afternoon to fully understand, and I offer it now the same way Eleanor offered her own hard-won wisdom. Plainly, without dressing it up as anything grander than it is. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels the way you imagined it would while you were still fighting for it. I'd spent 33 years believing that catching the guilty was the whole of the work, that once the cuffs went on, the story was essentially finished. What I learned in my own kitchen, in my own son's grief, in a shoebox of letters my wife never found the courage to send, is that catching the guilty is only ever the beginning of the real work, which is figuring out what still deserves to be rebuilt once the guilt has been accounted for. The second thing that happened that autumn, and I consider it the truer ending of this whole ordeal, had nothing to do with courtrooms at all. The Regional Postal Inspection Office, at Marcus's quiet urging, decided to hold a small ceremony in October. Nothing large, nothing performative. Just a modest gathering in the same field office conference room where I'd trained young agents for 2 decades, to formally recognize the role my cooperation had played in dismantling a fraud network that had, by the time the full investigation closed, been confirmed to have victimized 19 elderly people across 4 counties, Doris Feldkamp among the very first. They gave me a small plaque, the kind that means less for what it says than for who's standing in the room when they hand it to you. Doris Feldkamp was there. She found me afterward, near the coffee station, and took both my hands in hers, her grip stronger than her small frame suggested it would be. I'd stopped believing anyone would ever look hard enough to catch him, she told me. You did that. An old man nobody thought was paying attention anymore. I told her the truth. The same truth I'd eventually tell a room full of people at my son's vow renewal. I almost believed them too, for one bad afternoon at my mailbox in March. Almost let them convince me the fear was really forgetting. She squeezed my hands tighter at that, understanding it, I think, better than most people could have. Derek stood near the back of that small conference room with Miles on his shoulders. Vanessa's absence a fact none of us needed to say out loud, the ache of it present but no longer sharp enough to ruin the day. Carol Ashby came too, sitting in the second row with the quiet, unassuming loyalty of a woman who'd been leaving my mail on my porch step for over a year without ever once asking for credit or explanation. 3 of my old colleagues drove in from 2 states over, the same men who'd stood at Eleanor's funeral, the same men who understood, without needing it, explained what it costs a person to keep showing up for justice long after the badge that used to authorize it has been turned in. Somebody asked me, near the end of the afternoon, what I'd learned from all of it. The kind of question people ask expecting a short, tidy answer they can carry home in their pocket. I thought about my father, who taught me to write a K that never hesitates. I thought about Eleanor, standing at our mailbox for 38 years, leaving small notes in with the bills because she understood something about love that took me most of a lifetime and 1 terrible year to finally understand myself. I thought about Derek's face reading his mother's unsent letter and Vanessa's face in that ballroom doorway, caught somewhere between fury and relief that the weight had finally been taken from her hands, however badly. I've spent my whole career believing the mail always finds its address eventually, I said. I used to think that was only true of letters. I know now it's true of almost everything a person tries to bury. The truth The debt, the apology you never sent. Given enough time, it finds you. The only real choice you get is whether you're the kind of person who's built a life worth being found in when it finally arrives. Nobody clapped for that either. Some rooms simply go quiet the right way, and you learn eventually to recognize the difference between silence that means nothing and silence that means everything. Winter came slow to Millbrook that year, the way it always does in Pennsylvania, gray and patient, more like a held breath than a season. I kept walking out to my mailbox every morning at 9:15, the ritual Eleanor had built over 38 years, and I'd kept, at first, only because stopping felt like losing her twice. Something had changed in me by December, though. Something I couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't lived through the specific arithmetic of that year. A forged signature, a shoebox of unsent letters, a rubber stamp made from a funeral guest book, a grandson's small hand finding mine in a silent ballroom. The hesitation was gone. I noticed it first on an ordinary Tuesday, cold enough that my breath fogged in front of me, walking down the driveway the way I had every morning for 14 months of grief and then 3 more months of quiet investigation, and I reached into that mailbox without the old flinch, without bracing for an emptiness that used to feel bottomless. Inside, alongside the usual bills in the Regional Postal Service newsletter, was a small folded piece of paper, unstamped, unmailed, the way Eleanor used to leave hers. Miles had written it in the careful, uneven print of a 7-year-old, still learning how letters are supposed to sit on a line. Derek must have driven him over early, before school, and let him slip it in without saying anything. The same quiet kindness Eleanor used to practice without announcing it. Grandpa had said, "I checked the mail for you today so you don't have to be sad by yourself. Love, Miles." I stood in my driveway a long time, holding that small, folded page, the cold working its way into my hands, the porch light across the street, clicking off as Carol Ashby's morning routine wound down for another day, and I thought about everything that had traveled through that mailbox over the course of one long year, the fraud, the fear, the slow unraveling of a family built on secrets, and now this, small and handwritten and entirely undeserved in the way the best kindnesses always are. Eleanor used to say the mail always finds its address eventually, even when it takes the long way. I understood, finally, standing in that driveway with my grandson's note in my hand, that some of the most important things a family sends each other were never lost to begin with. They were only ever waiting, patiently, at the address they belonged to all along, for someone brave enough, or simply broken open enough, to finally go looking. And to everyone listening who's ever had a family member try to convince you your own memory, your own instincts, your own worth couldn't be trusted anymore, trust yourself anyway. The people who benefit most from your doubt are rarely the people who love you the way they claim to. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you left a comment telling me where you are and whether you've ever had to protect yourself from someone who shared your own name. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that it's never too late to check the mailbox yourself. And if this is your first time here, consider staying. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you for staying with me until the very last word. I read every single comment. A brief note before you go. Certain names, details, and timelines in this account have been adjusted for privacy and narrative clarity, but the emotional truth at its center remains exactly as it was lived.